Hello, I have some very exciting news. New merch. I think that you will like it. Boom, a That We Know Of beanie. Boom, a Great Dying t-shirt. This one is so sick. And also, the return of the Smilodon hoodie. Because this was such a favorite last year, I've decided to add another design. Boom, Spinosaurus zip up. And check it out. All the tops are complete with facts that make for an educational, yet sick piece of clothing. This is all available to pre-order on my website until December 8th at 11:59 p.m. PST. After that, orders are going to start shipping out the first week of January. So, in case you decide to get these as a holiday gift, I'll be sending a little handwritten note to your email that you can print out as a little hint for the gift. And also, in case you don't want to wait, everything from the last drop is 15% off. It'll also ship faster since it's not in the pre-order model. Those are in stock. So go check it all out at lindsaynikole.com. I repeat, that is lindsaynikole.com. Oh, how exciting to have arrived at the Paleogene Period. We're at the Paleogene Period, out of dinosaur territory, and thank God for that. It lasted from 66 to 23 million years ago. I know, the numbers are much smaller. Shit is starting to get real, i.e. modern. We are finally entering the Cenozoic era, which is the start of the age of mammals, and is also the one that we currently live in. We are currently in the Cenozoic era, so this is going to feel very close to home. It's going to feel very cozy. There's a chance this era is not as appealing to you. So far, this series has talked about strange specimens that would look like aliens on our planet today. Animals so massive, we can't even begin to imagine their true size. Shit like that doesn't really exist anymore, except for whales. And how many people have actually seen a full whale at once in real life? Not many. And it is true, the vibe of these videos is going to be different, but I think in ways that might be even more inspiring. And here's why. Mammals are what feel like home to us. They're some of the first animals we were introduced to as kids. Cats and dogs as pets. Lions, giraffes, elephants in toy sets and coloring books. We feel most connected to mammals because, also, we are mammals. And now, we get to see how these modern mammal groups emerged. From mere rat-like creatures to the new top predators. And the new unusual. You know how when you know someone, you feel much more connected to their side quests and the things that happen to them? Like, for example, and this is true, my cousin, Sam, ran 100 miles straight, and it took him 27 hours. He ran into the night, 27 hours straight to run 100 miles. When you hear that, you're like, damn. When I hear that, I'm like, what the fuck? Dude, that's my cousin. My cousin Sam ran 100 miles in 27 hours. That's the most insane thing in the entire world. What the fuck? Naturally, I feel more connected to the things he does than if he were a stranger. That's life. That's common experience. What is my point with this? I think the same phenomenon might happen here as we explore the mammalian explosion. These are your brethren, and these are you as well. We're gonna explore what the first elephants looked like. That's gonna be weird. What did the first whales look like? That's gonna be weird as well. The first dogs. What are some strange mammalian groups that got lost to time? You're gonna be like, what the fuck is all this? I think you're gonna like it. It's gonna be a new type of what the fuck. So, buckle up for all that and everything else in between. My name is Lindsay Nikole, and this is the history of life on Earth that we know of. Now that we've arrived at our current era, the Cenozoic, the structure is changing a bit. This is just a little FYI, a little PSA. We're adding a smaller division of time into the equation. Last time we covered the Mesozoic era, which is broken into 3 periods: Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Each of those periods can be broken down into a smaller unit of time, called an epoch. Epoch, if you like the British pronunciation, epic, if you like the American. And I like epic, because it's more epic. Wow. Epoch. I haven't included the epochs in the episode so far because people don't really use them when talking about Paleozoic or Mesozoic animals, at least in a casual, prehistoric, conversational sense. They use the periods. For the Mesozoic, it's kind of 50-50. Like, some people do it, other people don't. Honestly, that was a personal decision of not being psychologically prepared to do that. And I thought it would also make the organization of the video too messy. It's no secret the Mesozoic was already kicking my ass, so I was not interested in adding another element. But now, in the Cenozoic, that is not the case. Epochs are the way to go. We're pretty close to modern times in the context of geologic time, so it's easier to think about things in chunks of like 10 million years instead of fucking 30. And these animals are more known by the epochs they lived in rather than the periods, if that makes sense. Like, there's a much better chance that you've heard that the Megalodon existed in the Miocene Epoch rather than the Neogene Period, which is the episode next time. So, anyway, that is all to say. Now we're breaking the periods up into epochs throughout the video. I'll do a little general overview section, and then when we get to the stars of the show, most of the animals, we're gonna go epoch by epoch. In this video, in the Paleogene, there are 3. The Paleocene, devastatingly similar to the Paleogene, I know, the Eocene, and the Oligocene, PEO. Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, PEO. So, just hold on to that for later. And for now, we'll get the global conditions out of the way. We left off in the Cretaceous with the final splits of the modern continents. These were just drifting further and further apart. Generally, the climate went from warmer to cooler. About halfway through the period, because of the cooling, ice caps started forming at the poles, so sea levels decreased, the interior seaways dried up. Remember last time the flowering plants were popping the fuck off in what is known to science as the angiosperm terrestrial revolution, and to us as flower power time. That was still happening, obviously with a pretty big blip from mass extinction, but that paved the way for flowering plants to continue being innovative, trying new shit out. So, flower power time was still in full swing until like halfway through this period. One of the products of this continued revolution was the appearance of palms. We love palms. Last time I showed you my new palm leaf tattoo, and I have written in my notes to give you an update, and the update is there has been no update. I still have not gone back, and I still won't for a while. So, palms showed up, but they have their roots in the Cretaceous. But obviously the extinction rocks their shit. So, the Paleogene is when we start to see some of the more modern palm groups we know and love today. Another product of the flower revolution was the appearance of cacti, which I actually have. I have one. Hold on. This is a cactus inside of a cat. A cactus. So I'll just hold it here for ambiance. The fossil record of cacti is garbage. So for a long time, their evolution was completely unknown. But now, recent genetic studies suggest they originated somewhere in South America around the middle of this period, most likely from scrubby trees that lived in an area that was warm with dry seasons, and so evolved traits to help with the occasional dryness, to help hoard water. And then later, some started to violently hold water with the development of thorns. If you think violently is too strong a word to use, imagine falling down on this. Matter of fact, go spend some time in Arizona and get back to me. All right, the last thing about plants before we move on. It's worth mentioning that some of the earliest carnivorous plants were thought to have evolved during this time for a while. They've evolved multiple times within angiosperms. But turns out they might have actually evolved in the Cretaceous. At least the earliest possible carnivorous plant fossil dates to the Cretaceous, called Archaeamphora. So just so we're all keeping track, the earliest carnivorous plant and fungus fossils are from the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous was a fucking hellscape. So, anyway, we'll focus on the now, Paleogene. The flowering plants are still exploding, which means the insects were still exploding as well. Especially the group that includes some of the cutest insects, in my opinion. That's right, bitches. The weevils. Over 500 species of weevils have been described from the Paleogene alone, dude. They're just all over the Paleogene fossil record, like white on rice. It's really not that surprising if you think about it. Weevils are beetles, and beetles are abundant as fuck. 25% of all discovered animal species are beetles, which amounts to over 350,000 species of just beetles. That is a shit ton of beetles. So, 500 species of weevils in the Paleogene? Fucking whatever. Piece of cake. Alright. With the exception of weevils, because they were just abundant in the larger time frame, we're now going to turn our attention to the animals in the context of the epochs. Let's start off with the Paleocene, the first epoch of the Paleogene, which lasted from 66 to 56 million years ago. Quick, 10 million years of time. This is obviously the epoch that immediately followed the mass extinction, so it was very much a time of recovery. Species were quickly evolving to fill ecosystem roles that the extinction kicked to the curb, and so turns out this was also the beginning of many modern groups that we know and love today, as well as the start of some heinous groups. And as you would already expect, I'm going to give you a little mix of both. Let's start off with the fan favorite, the sharks. Turns out two of the most iconic shark lineages first appeared in the Paleocene. Carcharodon, also known as the white sharks, and Otodus, also known as the megatooths, or megateeth. The megatoothed sharks. The relationship between these two groups is questionable. Some scientists think they should be placed in the same genus, others think they should stay put. It's kind of difficult to pinpoint since the vast majority of fossil evidence they have to work with is just piles and piles of teeth. Teeth on teeth on teeth. So there's a couple species that might be related to both, or one, or none, really whatever, you name it. Paleocarcharodon, possibly related to or ancestral to the white sharks, including the iconic great white. They were much smaller based on the size of their teeth. Also, by the way, Carcharodon means jagged tooth. Paleocarcharodon means ancient jagged tooth. There is a similarity in the jaggedness of the teeth, but there's uncertainty if they're blood related like that. So, for now, they are called ancient jagged tooth instead of today's jagged tooth. We're just gonna leave it at that. Next, this one is a bit more understood. Otodus obliquus places the earliest species in the lineage that would eventually lead to Megalodon. in the next episode. Obliquous was much smaller than Megalodon at like 26 feet long, obviously still a big ass shark. For a long time it was thought the development of some of these massive sharks was influenced by the appearance of marine mammals, like early whales, sea cows, etc., skyrocketing them to the top of the food chain. You can tell where extinct animals sat in the food chain by the amount of nitrogen they have in their teeth. Places in the food chain are also known as trophic levels, by the way. So if you're at the top of the food chain, you might be at like trophic level 4 or 5. Trophic level 1 would be plants that make their own food. The next level might be a small fish or crustacean. Next one, a larger fish that ate that fish. Next one is an even larger fish that ate that other fish that ate that other fish, and so on. Nitrogen is passed through each exchange, because animals get nitrogen from their food, so you can tell what their trophic level was in general by the levels of nitrogen in their teeth. And so, scientists did this for Otodus obliquus, and it turns out their nitrogen levels were already high as fuck, even before marine mammals showed up in the water. So they were already tops of the food chains, probably just thriving since the marine reptiles in the Mesozoic got booted. They were ready to go immediately. I think that's very on brand for them. All right, next up are the crocodilians. If they didn't exist today, it would probably shock you that they were able to make it out of not one, but two mass extinctions, Triassic and the Cretaceous. And they pretty much look exactly the same. They just have the ideal body form. They're surprisingly adaptable. They can go long periods without food, like up to a year. In some cases, a year a crocodilian can go. They'll eat whatever the fuck and do whatever the fuck to get shit done. It's respectable. And also horrifying. There's a few specific crocodilian groups that have been found on both sides of the extinction layer in the fossil record. So, let me introduce you to them. First off, the Rachosaurs. Alive from 72 million years ago, so like 8 million years after the extinction, and then into the Paleogene. They were fairly big for crocodilians, with some species getting to like 30 feet long. They had very long, slender snouts, kind of like modern gharials. Initially, they were thought to be the ancestors of gharials, but that turned out to be false, based on recent genetic evidence. Next, the Dinosaurs. They had massive tails, and were kind of all over the place. They ranged from like 6 to 30 feet long, some were semi-aquatic, some terrestrial, some stayed near the shore, some lived in the open ocean. They could do it all. They also existed from the Cretaceous into the Paleogene. And next, Cebecids. Highly specialized crocodilians with flat, triangular-shaped heads, less teeth than you'd expect, and legs made for walking. Yes, another terrestrial crocodilian. This is what pit bulls look like to me, and that's a good thing. I like pit bulls. Unlike their brethren I just introduced you to, the Cebecids not only made it out of the Cretaceous, but also the Paleogene, all the way into the time of the first hominids, which is coming in the next episode. So, stay tuned for that. Alright, next is another group we know and absolutely love today that has their origins in the Paleocene. The penguins. Everyone loves a penguin. They are so cute, and also a little bit gay sometimes. And the earliest member of this darling lineage is known as Waimanu, about 3 feet tall and alive in what is now New Zealand. They had a solid mix of characteristics, clearly on the way to the penguin body form we know and love today. They were flightless and used their wings for diving. They had stubby feet, very penguin things, but they also had long, narrow bills, and an overall body form more similar to a common loon. Also, sidebar, I found out while researching that Canadians have a loon on their dollar coin, and because of that, they call those coins loonies. I like that a lot. I think that's very nice. Canada's just very whimsical, you know? I like it. They have their loonies and their maple syrup. They say sorry all the time. They kind of half committed to French. I like it. I like it a lot. With shit evolving at rapid speed, you probably wouldn't be surprised to find out that soon after the earliest penguins stepped onto the scene, some of them got big as fuck. Allow me to introduce you to Kumimanu, one of the largest penguins to ever exist, that we know of. Fossil evidence suggests they got to almost 6 feet tall. 6 feet tall, dude. When I was a kid, I thought emperor penguins got that big, because I had no gauge for size, you know? Everything was 6 feet tall to me as a kid. And I thought penguins named emperor penguins would be really big too. Like, this to me looked like an average family with a 6 foot tall father. But I also thought quicksand would be a bigger issue in my life than it is now, so what the fuck did I know? Another quick one to note is Ogigoptinks. Ogigoptinks. We'll call them Goptinks. The earliest owls that we know of. They're only known from fossilized foot bones, which are very owl-like in nature. So, more research must be done. Now moving on to something much less whimsical. Yes, the birds were diversifying to replace the roles of their avian ancestors and non-avian dinosaur relatives, that you might immediately assume never got worse than something like a modern-day ostrich. But unfortunately, or fortunately if you like chaos, that is far from true. A group emerged that feels like the dinosaurs rose from the dead for one last shot at domination. Today we call them terror birds. And for good reason. They're a group of fast and extremely predatory flightless birds that ended up dominating South America for 60 million years. They range from 3 to 10 feet tall and were defined by a large, sharp beak that could be used like a pickaxe. Some species are estimated to have reached 35 miles per hour. Scientists know they first appeared in the Paleocene, but their fossil record isn't that great. So I wanted to introduce them to you here, but we're going to pick up on them in the Eocene, where I can show them to you in the way they deserve. For now, I can introduce you to Gastornis, which is not a terror bird, but a terrible bird nonetheless. Gastornis, to me, is a terrible bird for a couple reasons. One, they look heinous. They got to 6.5 feet tall, couldn't fly, but probably ran very fast. Unsettling, like an ostrich, which are also unsettling. And two, they've historically been difficult to pin down in a lifestyle context. Early interpretations said they were the size of a horse, aquatic, swam like a swan, stood on one leg. They were first portrayed in media as apex predators that ate mammals. Early feeding style studies in the 90s backed this up, saying they had bite forces large enough to crush bone. But newer studies say the opposite, that they were instead herbivores, that they used that bite force to eat nuts and thick-skinned fruits. That is where they currently sit for now. Not the worst thing in the world, but still unsettling, I must say. So shit was chugging along. Groups were recovering and experimenting with new body sizes, lifestyles, etc. But so far I haven't truly introduced you to any certified terrestrial predators. No need to fret, I'm gonna do that now. Snakes. We left off with them finally losing their limbs in the Cretaceous. And the mass extinction really left room for them to step the fuck up, and gave rise to the largest predator on the planet following the extinction of the dinosaurs. That we know of. Titanoboa, who was the largest snake ever discovered. Until just this year. Used to be a that we know of thing that I said, but now it's not true anymore. A new contender was found. That is also in this video, and we'll get to them in a bit. But for now, let's focus on Titanoboa. They could get to 42 feet long, about the length of a semi-truck trailer, and 3 feet thick. They were so wide they would have had a hard time squeezing through your bedroom door if they were still alive today. And if one slithered past you right now, it would come up to your waist, while completely flat on the ground. Thick-ass snake. Like boas today, Titanoboa likely used constriction to kill their prey. Probably powerful to pop your eyeballs out like a cartoon character. And yes, if you were alive at the same time as Titanoboa, they would have easily seen you as a snack, alongside the crocodilians, fish, and really anything else they had an appetite for. They fucking owns the Paleocene. They were not to be messed with. Since snakes are reptiles, that means they are also sauropsids. Remember earlier in the series, I talked about this tug of war that has existed between synapsids, the group that includes mammals, and the sauropsids, the group that includes birds, reptiles, and crocodilians. The tug of war started back in the Permian and still exists to this day. In the Permian, synapsids were on top, with species like Dimetrodon, Cotylorinchus, Gorgonopsians, etc. Then the Great Dying happened. In that period of recovery, the sauropsids had the upper hand, and they evolved to shit, obviously. While the craziest species in the Mesozoic were sauropsids. But now the tide is turning. Yes, I just showed you a heinous sauropsid from just after the mass extinction, but I haven't even touched on the mammals yet. They were starting to pop off quickly. As I said, this is the age of the mammals. So let's start off with the most significant to our own lineage, Purgatorius. They represent the start of a huge chapter in our lineage, as some of the earliest primates that we know of. Very unassuming. I know, they look like just another rat. I swear, this is not what the whole section is going to be. Changes happened quickly, but I would be a traitor to our own kind if I didn't mention Purgatorius. So, just stay with me. Purgatorius fossils first appear about 100,000 years after the extinction, which is fucking quick on the geologic timescale. Mass extinction, the rat survived, and boom, primates start getting to work. Fossil evidence suggests they were climbers, living life in the trees, with extremely flexible feet, and they also ate plants and insects. Also, they weighed 3.5 ounces. Teeny, teeny, tiny. We'll get back to the primates later, so for now, just know they're making moves. The next one I want to introduce you to is another one that showed up just after the mass extinction, but you might have never heard of it. They have been lost to the wicked hands of time. The pantodonts. At first glance, unassuming. I know. They look like if you took every mammal you've ever heard of, mixed them up, and took the average of them. They look like every mammal and also none of them. They look like mush. I don't like my picture up there, you know? What the fuck is this? Has the spots of a cheetah, not the tear marks of a cheetah. It's not a leopard. It's just a generic African big cat, I guess. Anyway, the pantodonts were a group of herbivores. Turned out to be some of the largest mammals to evolve immediately after the extinction. One of the largest was Bear Lambda, the heaviest pantodont that we know of, with a weight of 1,400 pounds. Dude, this is a big deal. Remember, before, everything was a rat. Rat-sized, rodent-sized, maybe badger-sized. This is humongo. They had an easy lifestyle, chewed on soft vegetation, might have used their tail to support them on their hind limbs while they reached up into the trees for more delicious snacks. They seem like they would have been cute like panda bears, you know? I would say that's a safe assumption to make. This next one, though, I would say is the complete opposite of that. Coryphodon. This looks like a modern-day lab accident. I don't like their teeth at all. They seem to have lived a semi-aquatic lifestyle, chewing on aquatic vegetation. I find it very haunting when an animal that eats plants has gnarly canines like that. It's extremely unsettling. They were anywhere between 750 to 1,300 pounds, and that's all I have to say about them. The last pantodont I want to show you is one that I like a little bit more. Titanoides. Still herbivorous, still with the insane canines, but I feel a little more comfortable with this form. They were also smaller, like 300 pounds, so that feels more manageable. All right, moving on from the pantodonts to a group you will be a lot more familiar with. Another fan favorite, the proboscideans, which today is represented by the elephants, named such for their proboscis, the trunk. Proboscideans proboscis. One of the earliest representatives is Erytherium, which, as you can see, did not have a trunk. This was pre-proboscis. It was something that would evolve over time within the group. They were also very small, like 15 pounds, which I think is just darling. Another early relative is Phosphatherium, same kind of shit going on, but a little bit bigger, at 20 to 30 pounds. Now you might be thinking, Lindsay, these look nothing like elephants, and you said it yourself. So how do scientists know that they were even related to elephants at all? I have one word for you: teeth. The teeth always tell the tale. Elephant teeth are extremely specialized. They look like fucking high-traction shoe soles. And also, their tusks evolved from teeth. Erytherium and Phosphatherium have dentition that's clearly on the way to this more specialized look. Also other skull and jaw similarities and other scientific business. The elephant lineage evolved alongside a massive radiation that took place within mammals during this time. The ungulates, or the hoofed animals. You know a lot of ungulates today, like horses, rhinos, zebra, antelope, giraffes, things with hooves. There is a lot of diversity today within the ungulates. Elephants used to be classified as like a separate group within ungulates, but that turned out to be false. Genetic and fossil geographic evidence actually places them very far away from the ungulates. Now they have their own group called Afrotheria, which includes aardvarks, manatees, sea cows, etc. I hope my wording wasn't confusing. I think it was, because I said they evolved alongside them, and that's just not true. Elephants used to be thought of as ungulates, and now they're very much not. But it can kind of be confusing because, like, rhinos and hippos are ungulates, and elephants very much exist in ecosystems with a shit ton of ungulates, but they're not ungulates. Period. Just ungulates in spirit and morale. Anyway, the ungulates. In general, we think of them as herbivores. In documentaries, they are the prey. The springbok escaping the lion. The giraffe minding its business. That was not always the case. As always, nature never gives shit to you straight, and especially not right after a mass extinction. So, allow me to introduce you to the Mesonychids, a group of carnivorous ungulates that were alive through the Paleogene. They came in a variety of shapes and sizes, with smaller ones like Hapalodectes, who weighed only 2 pounds, and larger ones like Pachyena, whose name means thick hyena, like a hyena, but even heavier, more like a bear. Stay tuned because the ungulates are only going to get more heinous. When you think of mammalian predators today, you probably think of lions, wolves, hyenas, bears, etc. Turns out they all belong to the same group that made their first appearance in the Paleocene, carnivora. Any animals within this group are called carnivorans, which is a bit confusing and also easy at the same time. Carnivores are animals that eat meat. Sharks are carnivores, but they are not carnivorans. Carnivorans in group Carnivora include many carnivores today, but also some animals that are not carnivores, like pandas. They eat plants, but are carnivorans. They evolved from carnivores. Also, weasels. You would probably think of them as closer to rodents, but they are carnivorans and eat a lot of rodents. I'm kind of rambling now. All in all, as always, nature never gives shit to you straight. Mostly because our understanding and classification of nature is our own fucking fault, and we have nothing to blame but ourselves for the confusion. So, anyway, the earliest carnivorans appeared during the Paleocene and looked like a bunch of weasels. These early carnivorans and their relationship to other carnivorans, the ones alive today, once again lies in the teeth. They have a set of carnassial teeth, which are way in the back, and are sharp to cut meat and tendon. Another group of carnivores, closely related to carnivorans but not true carnivorans themselves, were the creodonts. They're first thought to be the ancestors to carnivora because they also have a set of carnassial-looking teeth, but turns out this was just another classic case of convergent evolution. They developed differently, so likely closely related but not as one. Creodonts were carnivorous as fuck, and as time went on, came in a variety of shapes and sizes. The classic Paleocene one is Paleonyctus. Kinda looked like a wolverine. They had jaws suitable to crush bones like a chip. There will be more creodont updates to come as we move into the next epoch. I want to mention real quick, there was an event that kind of distinguishes the Paleocene epoch from the Eocene. It's called the Paleocene Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM. PETM. It was a period of rapid global warming that lasted for about 200,000 years, possibly triggered by volcanoes. There was a huge release of carbon into the atmosphere that resulted in a temperature spike of somewhere between 9 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of deep-sea microorganisms went extinct because of this. There were a lot of general changes in different animal groups, and as you will see, a lot of new appearances. So now we're in the Eocene Epoch, which lasted from 56 to 34 million years ago. Obviously, the start of the epoch was hot as fuck, and it got cooler as time went on, so still following along the trend of getting cooler overall throughout the Paleogene period. And like always, we're gonna go group by group, starting off with a couple invertebrates that I found that I think that you will like. First off, a giant snail. How the fuck do you pronounce that? Campanile? Never would have guessed that. Alright, if you say so. Campanile giganteum. The size of a small child. Their shells got up to 3 feet long and looked like an acid trip. They look like wizards ready to sell you potions, with their cone-shaped, spirally designed shells. Also worth mentioning, they've mostly been found in France, which to me checks out. They look extremely French. And next, a giant ant called Titanomyrma. The queens could get to about 2.5 inches long, which, yes, is relatively small. But for an ant, nuh-uh. That is a big-ass fucking ant. And they're considered the largest ants to ever exist that we know of. These ants probably lived in forests and were likely predators, using their massive size to hunt other insects and maybe even small vertebrates. A godforsaken thought, if you ask me. Moving on to amphibians, with another world record of the largest frog to ever exist that we know of. But it doesn't have a name yet. It's thought to be in the genus Calyptocephalala, which is still chugging along to this day with species like the helmeted water toad and the wide-mouthed toad. And the humerus, the funny bone of this fossil, is larger than Beelzebuthos. So, you do the math. It would have lived near the coast of what is now Chile. That's really all I have to tell you, because I don't think there's been any updates on this discovery since then. So, here's the paper if you want to check it out. That's all I have to offer you. Moving on to the reptiles with yet another world record. Like I mentioned, the one that might knock Titanoboa off its throne. Announced just this year in 2024, allow me to introduce you to Vasuki indicus, potentially the largest snake to ever exist that we know of. The remains indicate a body size somewhere between 36 to 50 feet long, so potentially surpassing Titanoboa by the length of an average surfboard. There's still a lot of mysteries since this was literally just announced. Vasuki was likely an ambush predator that used constriction to kill their prey. What exactly that prey was, though, is unknown for now. Alright, moving on to the birds. Hi! I have another prehistoric penguin to show you. I know you were hoping for another one. This is Inkayaku, a big penguin, about 5 feet tall. In 2008, scientists came across their first fossil specimen in Peru, and it was unbelievably well preserved. The fossil was nearly complete, and had the first fossilized penguin feathers ever found. The fossil dated to about 36 million years ago, so only about 15 million years after the first penguins like Waimanu. Despite this, Inkayaku already had developed modern penguin features, like paddle-like wings and classic penguin-shaped feathers. Most birds have specifically shaped flying feathers for flying. Since penguins don't fly, they don't have those. Their flying feathers are just more regular feathers. That's what Inkayaku had, was just more regular feathers. Along with the well-preserved feathers were, you guessed it, melanosomes. They gave researchers insight onto the penguin's coloration. Obviously, penguins today are pretty much just black and white. That was not the case for Inkayaku. No, they're more of a gray and reddish brown, as you can see in this reconstruction. Still lovely if you ask me. Now let's move on to the less lovely, and pick up where we left off with terror birds. I mentioned that they dominated South America for about 60 million years, but I want to turn our attention to a different location real quick, because just this year, in May of 2024, scientists discovered 2 toe claws that belong to a massive terror bird in Antarctica. They're similar in size to a more well-known species called Phorusrhacus longissimus, which stood about 8 feet tall. They're the first evidence of terror birds existing at all in Antarctica, so the fact that they were there in the first place, and this big, completely shifts our understanding of Antarctic ecosystems in the Paleogene. They were likely apex predators, like other terror bird species are everywhere else, pecking marsupials and ungulates to death. One of the worst ways to go, if you ask me. Another terror bird found in an unusual place. Levacotavis africana, found in, you guessed it, Africa. Specifically Algeria. Scientists are unsure if this species is a true terror bird, because if it is, it makes no sense. Africa was very far away from South America at this period of time in the Paleogene, like at least 600 miles away at the closest point of ocean in between. The likelihood of a group of flightless terror birds migrating there is pretty slim. They would have had to raft there, floating on some sort of surface, most likely not a boat or a raft, or the ancestors of the group must have migrated much earlier, when they were able to fly at least a little bit, and were also much smaller. Or it's just another classic case of convergent evolution, and is in fact not a terror bird. There's no conclusion reached to this as of now. And just for your records, Levacotavis likely would have stood about 5 feet tall, so probably right about here on me. Other than that, the South American species were pretty small compared to that, about 3 feet tall. But no need to fret, this is just the beginning of a long Latino nightmare. You'd never guess by the way that I say Latino that I'm Puerto Rican. Alright, that's the end of Eocene birds and sauropsids. Now we're on to the synapsids, the mammals. Let's start off with the most bird-like mammal, the bats. Yes, bats appeared during this time. The scientific grouping bats belong to is called Chiroptera, and very early on in their evolution, bats looked extremely bat-like. A Chiropterus, one of the earliest bats that we know of. They were from the early Eocene, and despite their appearance, don't show evidence of being able to echolocate, which is just a series of different skeletal features, such as this coiled inner ear tube called a cochlea, which is enlarged in echolocating bats. A little bit later, though, came Paleochiropteryx from the Middle Eocene. Some of their fossils from Germany are extremely well preserved, with traces of fur, wing membranes, skin that makes up the wing, and also, you guessed it, melanosomes, which indicate they were brown, like you'd expect with a typical bat, and show possible evidence of echolocation already. They had the enlarged cochlea and had a stomach filled with fossilized insects. Just more typical bat shit. So this was all to say that bats were doing typical bat shit pretty much right when they became bats. Alright, moving on to carnivora, who had a lot of updates. Like I said, when you think of carnivorans, your brain will probably go right to big cats and wolves, the cat and the dog, and cat dog somewhere in between. Which, great show, by the way, and pretty twisted if you ask me. They don't make shit like this anymore. Nevertheless, carnivora, the cat, and the dog. These are actually the two main body forms the carnivorans started splitting up into during the Eocene. The dog-like caniforms, and the cat-line feliforms. Today, all carnivorans are split up this way. On the cat side, you've got cats, obviously. Usa, hyenas. That one might be surprising. They look like a solid mix of both, but this is about relatedness and coincidental overlap in body form. It's just the way the cookie crumbled. Also, mongooses, meerkats, etc. That's the cat side. On the dog side, you've got dogs, which came from wolves, and also foxes, bears, weasels, badgers, skunks, raccoons, walruses, etc. I know, these bitches are all over the place. That split between the feliforms and the caniforms started happening in the Eocene, and one of the first true canins, the true dog family, appeared as well. Hesperocyon. If you have a domestic dog in your home, you can thank Hesperocyon for that, which is kind of the more primitive form. They're thought to be the ancestor to the true dog family, like I said. So the wolves, foxes, wild dogs, etc. At the same time, the cat forms were developing too, but not in the way that you'd expect. The true cat family wouldn't appear until the next epoch that we know of, but you would never guess that by looking at the next group on the list, the Nimrabids, which looked like early saber-toothed cats, but were not saber-toothed cats or even true cats at all. Yes, they were on the cat side of the split, but had their own thing going on. Because of this, they're often called the false saber-toothed cats. It's like the crab thing all over again. As you will come to see throughout this era, the cat form copied itself to shit. So now we've got carcinization, croconization, and cactinization. Why do I didn't say that croconization line before. So where the fuck is that? One of the more well-known Nimrabids from the Eocene was Hoplophonius, which ranged from leopard to jaguar in size, and had more robust, stout bodies compared to big cats alive today. They also had a plantigrade stance, meaning the whole sole of their foot was on the ground. Like us, we have a plantigrade stance. Bears do as well. Cats alive today have a Why is that the hardest fucking thing to say out loud? Cats alive today have a digitigrade stance. Just their toe bones and the ball of their foot are on the ground. Dogs do that as well. And then there's a third stance, the unguligrade stance, which is done by, you guessed it, ungulates, where just their toes are on the ground. Foot bones just evolved into different forms over time. Anyway, Hoplophonius seems to have been a hypercarnivorous ambush predator that used their false saber teeth to deliver fatal bites to their prey. Some were apex predators of their ecosystems and were some of the most advanced carnivores of the time that we know of. Ahead of the next group on the list, the amphicyonids, also known as the bear dogs, which were not bears or dogs, but had traits similar to both, earning them the nickname bear dogs. They would live on to be vicious, formidable predators, but had humble beginnings in the Eocene, mostly like 10 pounds, fed on small mammals and birds. So we'll check back in with them later on. All right, next up is Hyenodon, which was not a hyena, and actually not even a carnivoran at all, but they were carnivorous as fuck. There are many different species that came in a variety of sizes. The largest got to the size of a modern bear. One of the more well-known species, Hyenodon horridus, was smaller, but still quite horridus. They had extremely powerful jaws, capable of snapping their prey's neck right in half. They ate whatever they wanted, which mostly turned out to be a variety of ungulates. So, let's move on to the ungulates. I mentioned in the Paleocene that the ungulates were about to go through a massive radiation. That really becomes clear in the Eocene. Just like the carnivorans, the ungulates split up into two main lineages, the artiodactyls, or the even-toed ungulates, and the perissodactyls, or the odd-toed ungulates. Let's start off with the odd-toed ungulates, which are named such because they generally have 1 or 3 toes on each foot. A single toe sounds heinous. Yes, but in practice, that is a horse's hoof. And speaking of horses, they first appeared in the Eocene. One of the earliest horses is Heracitherium. They are very small, about 2.5 feet long, and did not have the single-toe hooves yet, but were still early horses nonetheless. A later one is Mesohippus, from the late Eocene. Still no single toe hooves, but they had elongated foot bones for improved running, more setback eyes on the skull. They were a bit larger and were developing more specialized horse teeth. Horses are on the move. Today, the odd-toed ungulates also include rhinos, which have 3 toes on each foot. And this next one on the list is definitely rhino in spirit, but not true. Rhino, Megacerops, known for their iconic protrusion on their snout, and one of the largest terrestrial animals of the Eocene that we know of. They were massive, at about 8 feet tall and 15 feet long, so closer in size to today's African elephant than a rhino. I think they look absolutely sick. But my favorite animals of the Eocene are the next group. We've talked a lot about nature being on acid for many times in Earth's history. The entire Paleozoic era was a bender. While things seem to finally be calming down a bit, more stable and mature, the next group is an exception, the Chalicotheres, considered one of the strangest mammals of all time. They look like a child made up an animal. They were kind of like a mix between a gorilla and a horse. They definitely had the equestrian evolutionary relationship, but walked on their knuckles like a gorilla and reached up into the tree branches for vegetation. Like many other groups, the early Eocene forms were not their prime. They would live on into the Ice Age, so I will keep giving you updates on them as we go on. Alright, so that was the odd-toed ungulates. Now let's move on to the even toes. They walk on 2 toes, which is like the classic antelope hoof. I have 2 notable groups to introduce you to, starting off with the more tame. Pobratherium, an early member of the camel family. That's right, bitches, we got camels in the Eocene too. They're about the size of a goat, and that's really all there is to it. Turns out, they were a mere snack to the next one on the list. Yeah, a predator on the ungulate list. And holy shit, Andrewsarchus, the largest carnivorous land mammal to ever exist, that we know of. And they walked on primitive hooves. They were no fucking joke. They were about 12 feet long and 6 feet tall at the shoulder. At the shoulder, dude. Their skulls alone were 3 feet long, and they weighed up to 2,000 pounds. Probably able to target species like Megacerops, if they wanted to. A wicked beast, if you ask me. Alright, now let's check in with the Afrotherians, which today includes elephants, manatees, and more. So let's start off with the elephant lineage, the early Proboscideans. Boom. Moratherium. This is the most devastating side profile I've ever seen. Despite this catastrophe, this is another step closer to the elephants we know and love today, from our perspective. To them, this was their final form. They didn't even know they looked like this. Technically, this isn't a direct ancestor to elephants. This is more of a little offshoot, but part of the legacy nonetheless. They're about the size of a tapir, which I guess doesn't look much better, but they make it work. They're more ugly cute. Maybe Moratherium looked more like this and the reconstructions just don't give them enough credit. I don't know. As you can see, they were kind of on their way to the trunk, with a flexible upper lip. An analysis of oxygen and carbon isotopes in their teeth suggests a plant-based, semi-aquatic lifestyle. One that was much more on the way to elephants was Phiomia. They were a bit larger and also had a short, but still valid, trunk. Also some pretty gnarly tusks, reminiscent of the later Platybelodon, which we've talked about on this channel and we'll get into in the next period. So for now, we'll move on to an unusual one on the list, Arsinoitherium, who, just like Diabloceratops, also looks like they listen to Lorna Shore. They're about 10 feet long and had 2 massive facial horns. This is a godforsaken image. Apparently, they were supposed to appear in King Kong in 1933, which is what this is from, but it didn't make the final cut. I feel like this qualifies as antique shit that I have a problem with. And it checks out because it's 1933. So, another big step for Afrotherians was the transition to water with the group Sirenia, which today is represented by manatees, dugongs, and sea cows. One of the oldest Sirenians that we know of is Pisosiren, which kind of looks like a cross between a hippo and a manatee. They had adaptations for both aquatic and terrestrial ways of life, so probably split their time pretty evenly between their 2 properties. Later came Protosiren, who had more aquatic characteristics, as you can see, but was still not fully committed to the ocean. By the late Eocene, there were fully aquatic species like Eocene. When you think of Sirenians, it's not surprising to find out that they're closely related to elephants. This looks like an aquatic elephant. But there's one group of marine mammals that has Eocene ancestors that, at first glance, you'd never expect. They're the marine mammals. Yeah, the whales. They evolved from a dog-sized artiodactyl that was alive in the Eocene. I know I said I only had 2 artiodactyl species to show you before, and that is still true. Because I'm passing the evolution of whales to a good friend of mine, Ben, who happens to be an expert in the field. You're probably familiar with his channel, where he does tons of paleo updates and spotlights, and has not been afraid to take on the Spinosaurus shit show. He actually just got his master's a few weeks ago, focusing on the evolution of whales and comparing their anatomy to that of ichthyosaurs. So he is literally the best person to turn to for this section of the video. So, I'm gonna hand it over to him now. Ben, take it away.
The evolution of the cetaceans, from land-living ancestors that looked like tiny deer things to the biggest animals that have ever lived, is one of the most spectacular evolutionary transformations in the history of life that we know of. So we couldn't talk about the Paleogene without taking a quick detour to follow the journey of whale evolution. The Paleogene period saw the appearance of the hoofed mammals, the ungulates, and within them arose the even-toed ungulates called artiodactyls. This group quickly became very diverse and remains so today, but one lineage within the artiodactyls took things in a very different direction from the mostly terrestrial lifestyles of all the other members of the group. About 50 million years ago, a little artiodactyl species called Indohyus appeared. Known from fossils found in India, which at that time bordered the shrinking Tethys Sea, the cat-sized Indohyus was mostly terrestrial but seems to have spent quite a bit of time in the water, with dense limb bones to keep it submerged and isotope ratios in its teeth indicating aquatic tendencies. Indohyus seems to have been walking along the bottoms of rivers and other waterways with its dense limbs weighing it down to feed on vegetation and small invertebrates underwater. Around the same time that Indohyus and its relatives were striding along the riverbeds of prehistoric India, another lineage that had split off from a common ancestor with Indohyus a few million years prior were also wading through the waterways of South Asia. These were the Pachycetids, the first true cetaceans. Although they were still mostly terrestrial animals with 4 limbs for supporting their weight on land, the wolf-sized Pachycetids again had very dense bones that would have helped them to stay submerged, and tooth isotope ratios consistent with lots of time spent in river systems. They also had features of the inner ear bones similar to modern whales. These animals likely hunted prey in rivers by bottom walking, as well as doing a bit of paddling and undulatory swimming. Also living around this time in the Indo-Pakistan region were the Ambulocetids, their name meaning the walking whales. This group includes the well-known Ambulocetus, for which some very complete fossil remains have been discovered. You can think of this ancient whale as essentially a mammalian crocodile, and indeed paleontologists have suggested that it lived in a similar way, lying in wait in rivers or lakes for unsuspecting land animals to wander too close to the edge before jumping out and clamping its jaws around them. However, other researchers have questioned the terrestrial abilities of Ambulocetus, finding that it might not have been able to support itself on land. The Remingtonocetids were another of the oldest cetaceans that still had ties to land. They also inhabited the Indo-Pakistan area, between about 48 and 40 million years ago, though they had begun to spread further afield, with fossils of these beasts turning up in Egypt. They looked even more like mammal versions of crocodiles than Ambulocetus, with very long snouts and elongated bodies that would have been held close to the ground by their short limbs. Remingtonocetids could likely still walk on land, but they had many clear adaptations for swimming and probably inhabited nearshore marine settings, where they hunted underwater for their food. So the whales had started venturing out from freshwater environments and into the sea. This brings us to the Protocetids, which appeared at some point in the mid-Eocene Epoch about 47.5 million years ago. This was a much more diverse family than the ones we've looked at so far, being split into 3 subfamilies and including at least 25 different species. This group represents the start of the global distribution of whales. They again originated in the Indo-Pakistan region near the shrinking Tethys Sea, but fossils of the Protocetid species that lived later on in the Eocene have been found across North Africa, Europe, and the Americas, indicating that they very quickly diversified and expanded their ranges. Protocetids were still apparently nearshore semi-aquatic animals though, with most species still able to support their bodies on land. Towards the end of the Middle Eocene, about 43 million years ago, the basilosaurids emerged in our planet's waters. These cetaceans were fully adapted to life in the water, and they became quickly widespread and diverse, being known from every continent. They include the famous and fearsome predatory species Basilosaurus with its very long and almost serpentine body, plus the recently named Perucetus colossus, which for a time was a contender for the heaviest animal that has ever lived, although other estimates have since downsized it a bit. It was then from somewhere amongst the different species traditionally considered as basilosaurids that the ancestors of the modern whales split off. That might sound somewhat vague, and that's because it is, with a few very recent studies finding different positions for where exactly they branched. Nevertheless, at some point in the late Eocene, they made their entrance. The extinct cetacean groups we've looked at up until now are collectively known as Archaeocetes, the ancient cetaceans. But now the Neocetes were here, the new cetaceans, which includes the living Mystacete, the baleen whales, and the Odontocete, the toothed whales. The oldest Mystacete that we know of is Mystacodon from Peru, at 36.4 million years old, living near the end of the Eocene Epoch. The early baleen whales were still toothed at this point, and then later species such as the 33 million year old Maya balena were toothless. Baleen for filter feeding then seems to have evolved after this toothless stage. The odontocetes are thought to have diverged from the mystocetes about 38 million years ago. All living odontocetes echolocate, and this ability seems to have evolved pretty early on in the lineage, within 5 million years of their origin. Interestingly, it also seems that echolocation actually convergently evolved twice in odontocetes, once in an extinct group called the xenorhophids, and then again in the ancestors of all living toothed whales. Both the odontocetes and mystocetes continued to undergo various pulses of evolutionary radiation throughout the Oligocene Epoch that follows the Eocene, and then into the Neogene period as well, eventually leading to the wonderful diversity of whales we see in our waters today. The evolution of whales is truly one of the most fascinating aspects of the history of life on Earth. These fossil discoveries of transitional cetacean species beautifully illustrate the immense transformative power of natural selection across large timescales and the remarkable adaptability of mammals. So that's a very brief look at whale evolution. I hope you find it as fascinating as I do. Back to you, Lindsay.
And that is why Ben is the best. Also send him a congratulations in the comments for finishing up his masters. That is bad bitch business. And that takes us into the Oligocene Epoch, the last of the three that make up the Paleogene Period. Continuing on with the trend from before, by the time the Oligocene came around, the world was pretty cold. Antarctica was a sheet of ice. It hadn't been before. That was new. So now let's look at some of the animals that were new as well. Starting off with the terror birds. Psilopterus was one of the smallest terror birds that we know of. Got to about 2.5 feet tall. They were more sleek, more slender than other terror birds, and maybe could have still been able to fly. Despite their tiny build, they would have been a formidable predator to the small animals of a rat size. And another one, Andrewsornis, much bigger at about 5.5 feet tall. They used power, as well as speed, to annihilate their prey. And by the way, both of them are from Argentina. Next is not a terror bird, but a very large seabird, Pelagornis. Not just a very large seabird, but the largest wingspan of any flying bird ever that we know of. At up to 21 feet long. Dude, that is twice the length of my room. I literally can't even comprehend that. They were not only large, but also heinous. Their beaks were horrific, lines with teeth-like projections on them. This is a bird out of a nightmare, if you ask me. This is the kind of bird that would have confirmed my hatred for birds before I started appreciating them like an adult. And now, let's move on to the mammals. I know, the mammals already. From my perspective, while researching, and hopefully the fossil records perspective as well, the Oligocene was kind of sandwiched between two really intense epochs with a lot of shit going on. The Eocene, check, and the Miocene, which is coming in the next episode. So the Oligocene was kind of like shit was chugging along from the next epoch with a few appearances of new groups. One of those was Ecaltidea. A carnivorous rat kangaroo. Quite a fucking name, I know. Rat kangaroos are marsupials, so from Australia. Not to be confused with the kangaroo rat from North America. This was a killer rat kangaroo with buzzsaw-shaped molars, perfect for ripping flesh. And next, big update. We finally have our first true cat. Allow me to introduce you to Proailerus, the ancestor to Koya, Odie, your cats at home, and all of the lovely cats around the world. Proailerus was somewhere between the size of your typical house cat and an ocelot. It had features more like a mongoose. Again, kind of the primitive form. They had slightly retractable claws. Check. But slightly longer muzzles than cats today. So probably looked like a fusa in real life. Round of applause for the cats. This next one is one that has no connection to any species alive today. It was an evolutionary dead end, and I'm upset about it. It just looked like a baby hippo permanently. But it wasn't related to hippos at all. It belonged to a group called Desmostylia, which was an order of aquatic mammals that existed from the Oligocene to the Miocene. Like, boom. Come and gone like a fucking torpedo. Acheroa was the smallest Desmostylian that we know of, and also the cutest. They're about 5.5 feet long and had very small tusks. Fossil evidence suggests they were pretty much restricted to the water, but maybe moved around on land to rest or mate. Other than that, not interested. They had very strange teeth, unlike those of any animals alive today. So what they ate? Who fucking knows? Probably seagrass or kelp, which seems very on brand for them. I hope you like them as much as I do, and I hope I made your day by showing them to you. Now let's move on to the ungulates, which, as you would expect, have some of the stranger specimens of the Oligocene. Starting off with Pyrotherium. Looks like an elephant ancestor, but was not. Their name means fire beasts, because their fossils were found in volcanic ash deposits. Totally and completely badass. Pyrotherium, like I said, was an ungulate, but not within the bounds of even or odd toes. Their place in the ungulate family tree is very much up for debate. Their characteristics are so unusual they were thought to be marsupials at one point. Not anymore. But for now, they are the mysterious fire beasts. I have a quick little Colicothere update for you before we move on to the more outlandish. Borisiakia, a large Colicothere with a sloping back and longer front legs. They were 13 feet long, and I like them a lot. That's it. I just like them. And now, I've got two more left for you. You've been a great crowd. I love this city. So I'm gonna end the show with some certified bangers. Picture a pig. Now picture a hell pig. What could that possibly look like? Perhaps like this. Allow me to introduce you to the entelodonts, a group of ungulates that are more commonly known as hell pigs. They actually first appeared in the Eocene, but reached their most heinous forms in the Oligocene, which is why I saved them for some of the last. Obviously, the bony projections on their skulls are just heinous, which has led to shit like this. Grotesque. Also this. What the fuck is this? Definitely the victims of shrink wrapping and early reconstructions, reminiscent of Esteminosuchus. So here's what the fuck they got going on. They were either hunters or scavengers. Maybe both. Either way, they were definitely tearing shit up. One particular genus stands out. Daedon, one of the largest entelodonts that we know of. They were about 6 feet tall at the shoulder, dude. A 6 foot tall pig. Not true pig, but whatever. A big fucking pig. But what's more troubling is a model that was made of them in 1910. Just look at it for a second. Not too long, because there's probably a demonic presence in it. It's called the Hyas, after Dino Hyas, which is the scientific name they used to have. This was made by a famous American sculptor named Theodore Mills. Other things he's worked on? Making the cast of Abraham Lincoln's face only 60 days before Lincoln was assassinated. Coincidence? I don't think so. There's something terrible going on here. Anyway, that's the hell pigs. We're gonna end on a much lighter note, with what just so happens to be one of my favorite extinct animals of all time. I feel like I can't say it's my absolute favorite, because now I know of so many. But usually when people ask me what my favorite extinct animal is, I say this one, Paraceratherium, possibly the largest land mammal to ever exist, that we know of. They kind of look like a mix between a giraffe and an elephant, but were actually a type of rhino. It's like a 3-for-1 special. They were about 24 feet long and taller than a 2-story building. When I first learned about them, I lived on a 3rd-floor apartment, and I remember imagining looking out into the courtyard and seeing them walk through with the tops of their heads almost reaching my level, and I thought that was just the most insane thing to think about. Obviously, we've talked about sauropods that could get much bigger than this, other animals that got taller, but this one just hits a lot closer to home for me. I think it's because they're easier to imagine, because they're mammals, and they just look more like what I know today. I mean, dude, you could just walk right under them. Just imagine that. I think that's so cool. And they'll definitely get their own dedicated video eventually, but for now I'll just stick to the quick facts. Unfortunately, there's not a lot known about Paraceratherium. They've gone by many names in the past, depending on what country they were found in, which was extremely confusing and probably led to a lot of delay in understanding them more. You might have heard of them as Indricotherium, which was the most common other name. There was also Aceratherium, Belucotherium, the Zongariotherium. They are confusion. They are mystery. There's a lot more we need to learn about them. They possibly had a prehensile lip. Their skull morphology supports the possibility of a short proboscis, like one of early elephants, or similar to a tapir. I think that's so cool. They represent that we know of to its core because we really don't know shit about them. And I love that. I say we make a petition to get more research going on. For now, we'll do it in the form of giving this video a like. And I will email every paleontologist in the country with demands. As Earth was exiting the Paleogene, the world was getting a bit warmer. There wasn't any mass extinction event. This was just one of those periods that moved on to the next. And paved the way for a new set of strange specimens, as well as the development of many of the beloved groups that had their start in this period. So be sure to subscribe so I can introduce you to them. Check out the new merch. Let me know what you think. I'm really excited about it. Keep up with my short form content on TikTok and Instagram. And check out Patreon for behind the scenes updates in our Discord server. And for now, stay curious. The world has a lot for us to learn. See ya!